First off, drop a comment down below and tell me if you were Fred Vasseur at Ferrari or Toto Wolff at Mercedes, who would you pick as your number one driver? I want to know. So drop a comment down below because I'm very interested to see what the split is going to be across the 4 options here. So make sure you drop a comment. Well, wasn't that Singapore race weekend just literally the most interesting one we've had all season? Personally, I haven't been this excited to talk about a race, and I haven't been this excited about watching a race and been this engaged while watching a race in ages. There's loads to talk about, not least the topic of this video, which is that some of the teams may be playing a little bit too nice with their driver lineups. Let's get into it. On the Mercedes point, you may have assumed that Lewis Hamilton is the number one driver in that team because of his tenure there and his achievements, and at several points in their time together, that would have been true. But as we saw in Singapore over the weekend, they seem to be giving as level a playing field as possible to these two, and arguably it cost them a win, but it definitely cost them a double podium. When Mercedes took their gamble and pitted under the virtual safety car to put on those sets of fresh medium tyres, there was about a 4-second gap between Russell in front and Hamilton behind, and they immediately started to put in those laps that were up to 2 seconds ahead of what the leaders Sainz and Norris were doing at that time. And by the time they caught up to Norris, Lewis Hamilton was all over the back of George Russell. That 4-second gap had disappeared, and he was having to take evasive maneuvers to avoid crashing into him. And for whatever reason, be that, raw pace, be it George didn't fire up his tires as effectively, it was clear that Hamilton did have more pace than him, and he did come over the radio at the very end saying, can you ask George to go faster, to speed up and get past Norris? Now, the reality is, though, that George Russell was already pushing to the maximum, and partially thanks, in fairness, to Carlos Sainz's clever use of DRS to help Norris defend from the two Mercedes, ultimately George pushed so hard that he suffered that lapse of concentration right at the end of the final lap and tipped the wall and ended up essentially binning his race and also binning Mercedes' dreams of a double points finish with it. And to be fair, this isn't the only example of a Mercedes united front that we've seen even just recently with their drivers. I did find it interesting that they chose to announce both of the re-signing of contracts at the same time, and that they decided to sign both of these drivers on the exact same timeline until the end of the 2025 season. Clearly, it seems to me that there is a real effort being made to show a united front in a way that we haven't always seen from Mercedes in the past. And while that may seem well and good on the face of it, often it can actually cause problems. Now, there's a very similar situation playing out at Ferrari, and initially it looked like Charles Leclerc was the front runner. He was indeed the poster boy for the prancing horses, but it has to be said that so far this season he's played a second fiddle role to Carlos Sainz as far as performances go, because although Leclerc has had more podiums, Sainz obviously is now ahead on wins. He's also ahead on point scoring finishes and just finishes in general, because he's had 2 retirements. Meanwhile, Charles has had 3. And credit where credit's due here, the reality is that Carlos Sainz is the only driver not named Max Verstappen that has stood on the top step of that podium all year. So we have to let that sink in. I think what's notable here is that while both drivers in that Ferrari team have definitely voiced their frustrations very, clearly at times, it seems like Carlos Sainz has come back from summer break with this newfound mojo and determination to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't told to let the gap to Norris behind him close to within the DRS range to help Lando Norris. He made that call on his own, and a very smart one it was too. Meanwhile, things seem to have kind of stayed the status quo for Charles Leclerc. and his approach. And with rumours flying around that Sainz is already talking to representatives from the incoming Audi team about his future in Formula One, is it worthwhile for Ferrari to risk pivoting what was essentially a Leclerc first strategy to a Sainz first one? Whether we like it or not, historically, many of the most successful Formula One teams, if not the majority of them, in fact, have enjoyed the height of their success via one of their drivers over the other. That's just the way it plays out. And, you think about Ferrari, Michael Schumacher era, and you think about Lewis Hamilton, most of his days with Mercedes. They're examples of exactly what we're talking about in this scenario with these two teams. And in some ways, it's actually easier to manage a driver lineup where there's very clear roles and responsibilities accepted by both drivers. Now, that's not to say there aren't challenges that come along with your second driver having to swallow all that pride and ego, but it can still prove to be less complicated in contrast to a scenario where both drivers are on an equal footing and they're an equal machinery. There's not much separating them in, the way of ability and ambition. These are the scenarios where we see teammates crashing into each other. I mean, who can forget the days of Rosberg and Hamilton?
Round turn 3 we go, and it's Nico Rosberg and Hamilton's onto the grass, and Hamilton's had a massive crash, and he's crashed into his teammate. The two Mercedes come together as Hamilton tried to pass on the inside.
So as I say, the question is, what are Ferrari and what Mercedes going to do here? I think, Lewis Hamilton is obviously towards the latter end of his career, and Mercedes are putting the house essentially on George Russell being their future in the longer term. How are they going to manage that as far as the difference in ability, the difference in performance, the difference in consistency? What is that going to look like? And are they going to allow it to get in the way of their success or not? And similarly at Ferrari, you've got different variables, but kind of the same dilemma. It's just that both drivers are pretty much at the same point in their career. Obviously, both of them much younger than Lewis Hamilton, more akin to a George Russell stage. And I think there's just questions that have to be answered there about who is going to get preference, who is going to get priority. Thank you as always for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as I said at the beginning, please do comment down below. Tell me who you would pick. Put yourself in the shoes of Fred Vasseur and Toto Wolff just for a second and tell me who out of those Ferrari drivers and who out of those Mercedes drivers you would give the #1 spot to. Now, we're coming up on Japanese Grand Prix quickly after Singapore, so it's going to be interesting to see how all these dynamics play out. But I will be hanging out with you all in the comments when this video goes live. And in the meantime, take care and enjoy your racing.